Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the seminar series on higher education. My name is Jeroen Huisman. I'm glad to introduce our next guest for internationalization at home. We've been talking about higher education for 6 times now, mostly focusing on European developments. I'm glad that we now cross the big blue ocean and go to the US, and happy to hear more about developments in the US. The speaker of today, Morphew from the University of Iowa, is a good friend, colleague of mine, and I was sure that I would not embarrass him by asking him to talk about higher education in the US under this challenging title.
This is Jeroen's title, not mine.
It's my title, yeah.
I'm not that ugly of an American.
I know, we know. So I heard from you that you're willing to introduce yourself, so just a little bit more personal background on yourself in the introduction. In terms of the organization of this seminar, please do feel free to ask a question, to raise an issue during the talk. Christopher is more than happy to deal with that. It's no use to wait until the end of the presentation. Just step in if you have a question or a comment. Yeah? Christopher?
All right.
Yours.
Thank you. So thanks, Jeroen, and thanks for inviting me. I'm always pleased to come over and chat about my work and learn a lot about what's going on in other parts of the world. So I'm excited about that. And Jeroen mentioned that questions were good, and I told him to say that. So that's not just him. I would like to hear your questions. If I say something during this that is confusing, that's par for the course. And you should raise your hand and say, hey, that's confusing, and ask me a question. So I also will try not to speak really quickly, but I do speak very quickly, I've been told. Even people in the U.S. think I'm from the East Coast, but I'm not. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself first to give you a sense of the kind of work I do and where I come from on these things, because I believe that we are a function of our experiences and our backgrounds, and some of the things I'm going to be telling you today are likely a function of my experiences and who I am. So I'm a professor at the University of Iowa, which is pretty much in the middle of the country, where the corn and soybeans come from, right? The University of Iowa is a member of the AAU, which is a group of 62 public and private universities in the United States that represent some of the leading research universities in the United States, and 2 in Canada. It stands for, and it's confusing because there are 2 Canadian universities, but it's called the American Association of Universities, or the Association of American Universities. I can never remember which one. But there are 2 Canadian universities that are apparently okay with being an American association, Toronto and UBC, or Toronto and McGill. I don't think UBC is a member. The University of Iowa is also a member of the Big Ten, which is just as confusing as the AAU, because how many members are there in the Big Ten?
12 or 13?
12 is the correct number, yes, of course. Until next year, when there will be 14 members in the Big Ten. Maryland and Rutgers are joining the Big Ten next year, and there'll be 14 members in the Big Ten. So are they changing the name of the Big Ten because they're adding more members? No, because they believe the Big Ten is a brand that has value, okay? But the other members of the Big Ten, Michigan, Michigan State, Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Illinois, Minnesota, Northwestern, Indiana, Purdue. Wow, I think I got all. So it's, the University of Iowa is about, I think, similar size to Ghent, 33,000 students. We have about 10,000 graduate and professional students. So we're about 1/3 graduate and professional students. We have a very large medical school. Our budget for this year was about $3.3 billion. And we've got a $1 billion endowment. To give you some sense, that's a fairly large budget by American standards. And the $1 billion endowment is a fairly large endowment for a public university. But we're not we certainly don't think of ourselves as wealthy. In reality, we are. But we don't think of ourselves that way in comparison to the rest of the system. But it's a fairly elite public university. I think that's a fair way of describing it. My new title as of January is Executive Associate Dean. Jeroen can make fun of that later. He was already making fun of it this morning on the bike in. I'm in the College of Education. Our College of Education has about 100 faculty members, and we have 4 different departments. And my program area is actually called Higher Education and Student Affairs. So I teach in a program that prepares people to either do research or work as higher education and student affairs administrators. Does that make sense? I see a few looks of that doesn't make any sense. Okay? So, and it's, at some level, by the way, I agree with you. It doesn't make sense. My research interests are institutional diversity and how colleges and universities communicate. So I do a lot of work that I think it's fair to describe me as not mainstream in my perspective on higher education. The work I do tends to be peripheral to much of what's being studied in U.S. higher education. Frankly, I think my work fits in much closer, much better with European folks who study higher education than it does with American folks who study higher education. And Jeroen and I met because we were doing very similar dissertations, and we discovered that and have been friends and colleagues since. So, today's roadmap. Let me tell you what we're going to talk about today. Again, this was not my title. I don't mind the title, but it was not my title, okay? So I'm going to try to stay within the confines of the title here and build off of that a little bit. And the first thing we're going to talk about is just some brief background. It actually is bigger, okay? So the bigger and better title, I will actually cop to being bigger. Then we'll talk about some parts of it may be better. Okay, I'm not willing to say it's better. I am willing to say it's bigger. By the way, in America, bigger and better are exactly the same thing, so it doesn't matter. But the same advantage, and then I'm going to talk about some of the advantages of the American system, and then I'm going to try to make the arguments that some of these advantages produce less desirable outcomes than you might guess. Okay, so I'm going to use an article written a few decades ago by Martin Troe that talks about the advantage of the American system relative to the European system. And he points out some things that he believes are advantages, and I'm going to try to turn those on their ear a little bit and argue that some of those things are in fact producing very undesirable outcomes in the American system. Okay, and I'm going to be using, for all of this, my research. And my research really is, as I said, focused on how universities communicate. I do mixed methods research, so I do quantitative research as well as qualitative research. And I do research about, among other things, how universities create and the language in strategic plans and mission statements, how they advertise to prospective students, and then also quantitative research on some of the subsidies provided to students and somehow how that fits into missions and marketing plans. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. So it is bigger and more diverse. The American system is quite large. 20 million students at degree-granting institutions. If we were to include the thousands of other non-degree granting institutions, that number might be doubled very, very quickly. 4,500 plus colleges and universities, lots and lots of colleges and universities. A very strong private system as well as a public system. The system's still growing quite rapidly over the last the decade in the 2000s. 38% enrollment growth. That's surprising to some people. Some people think of the U.S. system as being almost universal already. Where's that growth coming from? The growth is coming in many ways from non-traditional students rather than traditional students. The number of 18 to 24-year-olds in the system peaked a while back, and really now what universities are doing are doing a lot of non-traditional educational programs. So a lot of that growth is coming, for example, from adult students who are coming back to work, students who never got their coming back to school, students who never got their degree in the first place coming back to school, those kinds of things. And then the other thing about I'm sorry, I'm over here, and this is where the mic is. Sorry. The other thing that really characterizes the U.S. system is its incredible diversity, and this is one of the great features of the U.S. system, and that is there is a unique organizational type in higher education for just about any population out there, which is sometimes produces negative outcomes as well. But so we have a very strong private system, truly private system. Students are funded by the government, but the institutions themselves don't get little or no money from federal or state governmental sources. Huge differences in size. We have colleges and universities that are 150,000 students, and we have colleges that are 40 students. Okay, the 40 ones are harder to find, but they're out there. by student gender. So we have women's colleges, we have men's colleges, we have co-ed colleges. Now, the women's colleges and the men's colleges are slowly dying off because it's very hard to sell going to a women's college to an 18-year-old woman, and it's even harder to sell going to a men's college to an 18-year-old man, okay? But they still exist. Student race, we have colleges that were founded for black students. We have colleges that were founded for Native American students. Now, in the case of the colleges that were founded for black students, which we call historically black colleges and universities, the H there is important because they're historically that way. Some of them are still 90% plus black or African American, but many of them are in fact majority white populations at this point. We have institutions that serve predominantly Latino students. We have great diversity by degree level. We have 2-year institutions. We have non-degree granting institutions. We have baccalaureate. We have institutions that grant only graduate degrees. We have lots of different kinds of those. Religious institutions. We have you name a religion, they founded a couple hundred colleges in the United States. Virtually all of our private colleges that were founded prior to, let's say, 1900 were founded by religious sects. Some of them, the typical private college was founded by a religious sect, but has become much more secular over time. But that's not always the case. We have very overtly religious institutions. Selectivity. We have institutions that select 5%. The places that you've heard of in the United States, like Harvard and Stanford and Yale and Princeton, they accept maybe 6% of the students who apply to them. So they get 100 applications, they select 6 students. They're very, very selective. But we also have institutions where the admissions test is essentially putting the finger on the wrist here, put hand in front of the mouth. Are you breathing? Do you have a pulse? Congratulations, you're in. We have many more of those than we have selective institutions, by the way. Okay, and in fact, in my university, which I think is I would describe again as a fairly elite flagship university, if you complete the required high school curriculum and score above a fairly minimal level, you are granted admission. There's a spot for virtually everybody there as well. Cost. We have institutions that are free, no tuition at all, and we have institutions that cost $60,000 each year. There aren't too many free ones left, but there are free institutions. And then in program focus, we have colleges and universities that offer just degrees in business or just degrees in engineering, and then we have college universities that offer degrees in everything. So Ohio State University, which has about 60,000 students, I think has 600 or 700 undergraduate degree programs. Very, very large, very, very diverse. And you can go on and on in terms of the diversity of the system. So it is bigger, it is arguably more diverse than any other system out there. Some parts may be better. This is the part I'm willing to say there's some parts that are maybe better, okay? If you look at world rankings, and if you look at the top of the world rankings, there are a few American universities there, okay? And by a few, I mean many, okay? But, so 10 of this was the most recent Times, and I pulled this up, but you could do this with Shanghai, you could do this whatever. So 10 of the top 13 in the Times are American universities. And we would argue the other 3, by the way, shouldn't be there, but that's a whole other discussion. I'm joking, by the way, you should know that. 25 of the top 40 universities, you go on down the list, many of the world's highest ranked universities are in fact American universities. We do elite research university very well. Okay, I think the rankings suggest that. You might argue that the rankings are based essentially on a normative elite research university model. I would probably agree with you. And until that changes, we'll continue to do very well. We have an impressive record of research and development. I mean, the research that goes on, the applied research, the basic research that goes on in American universities is some of the best in the world. I think there's no doubt about that. And we also have an ability to import some of the best talent in the world, right? Our salaries are higher. Our recruitment techniques typically have been better for international students and for international faculty. So we do those things very well. And the elites in the U.S. system are easily the richest in the world. Harvard's current endowment is about $38 billion. Okay, and there's a number of universities that have endowments larger than $10 billion that really don't need to charge tuition anymore, but still do. Even some of our public universities have very large endowments. I mentioned my university having $1 billion endowment. That's a fairly large endowment. We have some of the most selective institutions in the world, very low acceptance rates in their graduate programs and their undergraduate programs, and they're very well resourced. They pay high salaries. They provide great stipends and scholarships. They have wonderful manicured lawns. They have beautiful buildings. So the top of our system looks pretty good. I'm going to argue that maybe the top of our system isn't the entirety of our system. Intro in a piece in 2000. I thought it was earlier than this, but that was the date that was on it. So he's talking about the American advantage, and I wanted to use this piece. I thought maybe some of you are familiar with Martin Tro's work, and this might be a good kind of frame to use. So Martin Tro talks about sort of the American advantage in moving from elite to mass to universal higher education. So this idea that higher education in virtually everywhere at one point was an elite field, that only a very small percentage of the population got to go to college, right? And in the U.S., perhaps earlier than some other developed countries, we moved to more of a mass higher education system and then to what is maybe approaching a universal higher education system. And he's saying, in describing this pattern, this continuum, this evolution from elite to mass to universal, he argues that the reason that the U.S. moved faster and the reason the U.S. might be better positioned to move to universal was a function of lots of things. And he talks about those things. And I'm going to talk about those things and maybe turn them on their ear a little bit and say, yeah, those things are true, but some of those things are now leading to an American system that has some problems because perhaps it's gone too far over to the other side. So Tro talks about the system, and he says, listen, one of the advantages that the American system has had over time is its funding model. It's a very diverse funding model. We have had tuition at our public and our private universities for a long time. I think the last public system that didn't have tuition, the California community colleges, didn't have tuition, I think, as late as the 1970s. But ever since then, they've had tuition. And in fact, we've had a tradition of charging market-based tuition, right? That private universities and to some extent public universities are free to charge what they think the market will bear for their services. And he says that's a real advantage because it provides you with a diversification of funding. You get funding from from tuition, from the state government. We've also had a very strong tradition of funding from private sources. So I mentioned our endowment, right? So it's very common for private colleges and universities to have endowments that they can use that money to fund their operations. We also benefit from private gifts, right, and corporate gifts. We've had a long tradition of that kind of relationship. And he says that's a real advantage because not only does it diversify your funding model, right, but it also provides you with greater resources. So in the data that he was looking at, for example, and this was from the just before the turn of the 21st century, he said we were spending in the U.S. I think 2.6% of our GNP on higher education from public and private sources. And to give you an idea of that, 1.3 or half of that, 1.3% of our GNP was coming from private sources to support higher education. And that 1.3% of our GNP, and granted, our GNP is larger than at that point than anyone else's in the world. That was greater than any other country in the world was spending on its higher education. Period, right, from public and private sources. So we were spending roughly double on higher education at that point in time than other countries were. And he says this comes from this history of funding, this diversified funding model, right? So that's a big advantage, right? Another advantage, modular courses and unit credits. We've had a system that's operated with modular courses and unit credits where students can take a credit from this institution, a course from this institution, transfer it to this institution, right? So we've been operating with that system for a long time, and that's provided an advantage to students because it offers students greater flexibility. So you can start, lots of students do this, you can start your higher education degree here, you can go here, and you can go here. It's not unusual for me to look at a graduate student that we're considering admitting who's gone to 4 or 5 different universities, right? During their undergraduate period, their master's degree, and et cetera. And generally speaking, courses and those credits transfer fairly easily. Not always. He talks also about the increasing incoherence, and I crossed that out, to flexibility of the curriculum. He says the U.S. curriculum has become increasingly flexible, and what he means by that is our general education expectations have become more flexible over time, right? Students have been allowed to sort of choose their degree paths much more flexibly at the undergraduate level than anywhere else in the world. And that's an advantage for innovation and for flexibility as well. Less government regulation. So we've had lay governing boards, we've had private institutions with very little government oversight since the history of higher education in the United States in 1636. Connections with business and industry. I talked about that a little bit already. Strong connections with business and industry, providing good paths for our graduates, but also providing resources for the institutions themselves. Institutions have been very nimble in responding to what industry and what business has asked of them, perhaps more nimble than many other parts of the world. Responsiveness to students. We've always been sort of a student-focused culture in higher education in the United States. If students wanted a new degree program, we give them a new degree program. We've always been, and we have the management and governance flexibility to do that kind of thing. I'm not saying these are good ideas, by the way. I'm just saying this is the reality. And a tradition of competition. There's always been a tradition of competition. So there's always a perception of, Jeroen and I have talked about this many times, there's always a cognizance of, well, I'm here and you're here, and I'm trying to get to here, right? So there's always a competition for resources, competition for the best students, the best faculty, the highest prestige, best lots of things. And then finally, this notion of university service, which I'm hoping this is going to work, but I doubt it is. Let's see if this actually works here. And this is this notion of this Wisconsin idea. And the Wisconsin idea is this idea that public universities should be connected with their local communities and with their states. And they should provide service. And they should be a place where students come, get skills, and bring those skills back to the community. So let me see if I can play this video. All right, I pulled it up anyway because I knew this was going to happen. See? Of course, no, it's not there. Probably can't hear this, sorry.
Connecting with people in the community was very important. My degree from University of Wisconsin-Madison enabled me to be a pharmacist and participate in community affairs. Every person who comes out of that university is going to affect hundreds of other lives in the community and in the world.
So this is the University of Wisconsin. You guys have heard of the University of Wisconsin, right? This is one of the leading public universities in the United States. It's a member of the, I think I left it out of the Big Ten before. It's in the Big Ten. So this video was about, what was his name? James, John, it was on his pharmacy sign, I forget now. But this video is telling the story, and this, by the way, is the kind of thing I study. I study how universities market themselves, so that's why I'm showing this to you. But this is how the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is this really world-class research university, is trying to sell itself to the citizens of the state, and they're doing it through this idea of, we're a public university, and if you give us your resources, right? If you provide us with a tax base and the resources to fund us, what we will do is we'll take your citizens in and we'll educate them and we'll give back to the community and we'll give back to the businesses. And guys like this will come from rural Wisconsin and they'll come down to Madison and they'll come in and they'll get their degrees and they'll be taught a broad-based liberal education and they'll be provided with skills to start a business and be career focused. And they'll go back to their community like this guy, and this is why they use this guy, because he's a good marketing story. He'll go back to his community and he'll start up a pharmacy. And he'll start up a business and he'll employ people and he'll make his community better. And if you just give us more money, you'll get more of this guy. Okay? Now, in reality, if you give him more money, you might not get more of that guy, but that's what they want you to believe, and that's the idea of this Wisconsin idea. And Tro's arguing that this Wisconsin idea was a very important idea in promoting this notion of a liberal education for all citizens, and a liberal education that would connect you with your community. And universities were important, not just as these bastions of liberal elite learning, but these American universities promoted themselves as these utilitarian, pragmatic, community-focused kinds of organizations. And Tro's saying that's a big advantage, because you do that and you get resources from the state, and the people in the state believe in you, and the people in the country believe in you. And higher education's always enjoyed this very high public confidence, right? And that's in connection with the Wisconsin idea. There are some states that import students, and there are some states that export students. We are an importer of students. We are situated right next to Illinois, which is a huge exporter of students. And we like Illinois. It's a very nice place, okay? And we're very happy to charge those students 4 times what our students should pay. Because tuition at my university undergraduate is about $9,000, I think. And they're not paying $4,000. They're paying about 3 times that. They're paying about $25,000, right? They get some discounts, but they pay roughly $25,000. All right, so I'm going to argue that these same features can be a disadvantage. Okay, I'm going to argue that these same things that Tro has described can be really big disadvantages in a system, and some of my research focuses on how essentially they're turning into disadvantages. So the same flexibility, the same student responsiveness, the same ability to be governed independently and to have a diversified funding scheme and to get lots of money from different sources, those things I think can be a problem too. So let's talk about that. So, first of all, the American system really is not a single system, I would argue. Okay? The system that Tro writes about, and the system that you guys hear about, and the system that we hear about in our newspapers is our elite system. And our elite system is very nice if you're a member of that elite system. If you're not a member of that elite system, it's not such a great system. Okay? And in fact, you're arguably in a different system. It's not like students are applying to Harvard and a community college and just waiting to see if they get into Harvard. Okay? That's not the system. The system is if you're relatively well off, if you went to a good high school, if you even understand how college application works, you apply to Harvard, right? Or the best place you can apply. If you don't understand how those things work and your parents didn't go to college and you're from a low socioeconomic group, you don't apply to Harvard. You apply to the local public university or college, or the community college, or maybe a 2nd or 3rd tier private college. Okay? So there's really more than one system, I would argue. And the same students are not operating, all students are not operating across these systems. I would also say that the same sort of innovativeness, the same nimbleness, the same responsiveness that results in the American system having advantage moving from elite to mass to universal also creates a system where we are a little too customer oriented. Okay? Another way of saying being responsive to students is being customer oriented. And I think student responsiveness is fine. I think customer oriented causes some problems. When you start to see students as customers, when you start to see people from Illinois with dollar signs on them, right, you get problems. And I think that's where we're at this stage. Elite universities increasingly serve elite students. I'll show you some data here that document that in just a second. And students from historically underrepresented groups are much less likely to enroll in elite institutions and much more likely to enroll in institutions with fewer resources. Okay? So here's an example. Here's some selected graduation rates, and these are 6-year graduation rates. I realize these are 4-year institutions, but to give you an idea, the U.S. government does not even collect data on 4-year graduation rates anymore. Okay, we collect data on 6-year graduation rates because virtually very few students graduate in 4 years from non-elite institutions. So on the left, you have some of the institutions you may have heard of. Princeton, right? You've heard of Princeton. Harvard, UVA, Berkeley, UCLA, Michigan. So Princeton and Harvard are elite privates. The rest are elite publics, and you see graduation rates that are 90% plus, right? 90% of students, 9 out of 10 coming in the door, graduate within 6 years. In fact, at Princeton and Harvard, those rates are probably the same at 4 years. That roughly 98% of students from Princeton graduate within 4 years. By the way, the key to this is getting Princeton students. If I gave you Princeton students, they would graduate in 4 years too. There's nothing marvelous going on there. Okay? Not so great. The institutions on the right. These are all public institutions. Texas Southern, Cameron, Chicago State, Southern University, Coppin State. These are institutions where if you go in, and there's 100 students who go in, if you're lucky, 11% of you or 16% of you, 16 of you will actually graduate in 6 years. Very, very poor graduation rates. I would also point out that virtually all of those are HBCU or majority minority institutions. The majority of students at those institutions are either Latino or Black, and many of them are first generation and underrepresented. Okay? And this is what I mean about there being two systems. This system is not the same as this system. These are two different systems, and we have at least two different systems in the United States. Another example of this is, these are Pell Grant shares of underrepresented students by percentage at different institutions, the top 25 research universities. Pell Grants are the grants from the federal government that are provided to students who are particularly poor. Okay, so we use Pell Grant shares, that is the percentage of your undergraduate enrollment who's eligible for a Pell Grant, as an indication of, are you enrolling poor students? Okay, it's the best indicator of that. And to be eligible for a Pell Grant, you would need to earn less than probably $25,000 or $30,000 in the United States, which is pretty low. Okay, so these are the top 25 universities, and you can see that there are a few of them that enroll less than 10% of their students, so this would be, let's see, so Caltech, you've heard of Caltech in Pasadena, enrolls about 10%, 12% of its students who are Pell Grant eligible. So 12% of the students at Caltech are poor by this definition. Washington University is notorious for this. They have 7% of their students that are Pell Grant eligible. Okay. Some of the publics on here are better. So UC Berkeley and UCLA enroll more than a third of their students that are Pell Grant eligible. So there's some publics that are doing a little bit better. But you have to remember that they're required to enroll, they're public universities, they're required to enroll a certain percentage of California residents. California has a lot of Pell Grant eligible students. Okay, so they're going to get that just by a function of being in California. But to give you an idea of Washington U and some of these other places, my alma mater, my undergraduate alma mater, is number 4 on this list, so wonderful place to be. To give you an idea, these places have, Washington U's endowment's probably about $6 or $7 billion. They have plenty of money if they wanted to enroll more of these students. It's not that they can't afford to enroll these students. Tuition there is about $55,000 a year, tuition, room, and board. They could afford to pay for as many of these students as they wanted to pay for. But the argument about the question about cash cows, you might rather have a full-paying student than a student who's you're going to have to provide a scholarship for. These are arguably expensive students to enroll if you're going to provide full aid for them, which you're going to have to do. So there's to some extent a disincentive to enroll them.
And are there community colleges which have 100%?
There are community colleges that have very, very large percentages, yes, yes. And there are HBCUs, these historically black colleges, that have very, very large percentages. If you went back to this, I would be willing to bet you a lot of money that every one of these institutions enrolls a lot of Pell Grant students. Okay, and I would win that bet, I think. All right, so I'm going to argue that diversified funding, this what Tro has called diversified funding, has really given way to more reliance on tuition revenue. And this is the question back here. So at elite publics, for example, at my institution, tuition revenue has overtaken public support. Okay, right? In the current fiscal year, we got more than double in tuition than we got from the state government to support the University of Iowa. Okay, at places like Michigan, the figure is closer to 3 or 4 times. The tuition they're bringing in is 3 or 4 times greater than what they're getting from the state government to support the institution. Okay, so tuition is an incredibly important thing, even at public universities. Private universities, many private universities, 95% of their revenue is from tuition. Okay, non-elite privates, as I said, derive an overwhelming share of their revenue from tuition. Now, the more elite privates get less of their money from tuition because their endowments are so large that they can pull money from their endowments. Competition for students, particularly full-pay students, is intense. So we're not the only people that are trying to go into Chicago and find students who either aren't quite good enough to go to Illinois or didn't want to go to Illinois and who have the money to come to Iowa. Virtually every public university in the country has billboards up around Chicago saying, why don't you come to Arizona? Why don't you come to Maryland? Why don't you come to Iowa? Why don't you come to Kansas? So we're all recruiting for these students. And the reason we're recruiting them is we know that's a hotbed of pretty good students, but more importantly, we also know it's a hotbed of pretty good students who can't get into the flagship university in their state, who can afford to pay to come to our university. Okay? And students have become customers, which has consequences, I'm going to argue. So what does the student as customer model look like in the United States? Okay? And hopefully this is where it gets particularly interesting, and I'll speed up. I know he's focusing on the time here. So I think you can argue that there's become a disconnect between what we say is our mission and what we proclaim as our message. And I'm going to argue that's a function of this idea as student as customer. That we say we're about X, but when you look at what we do, we're about Y. Okay? I'm also going to say that a focus on selling popular products, we focus on selling popular products rather than selling our core academic functions. That we're selling something other than teaching and learning, right? And I think I'll provide you with some examples of that as well. And we also have pricing strategies that result in buyer beware. Buyer beware is a colloquialism in the US. Does buyer beware translate into Flemish or anything like that? Okay. It essentially means if I'm selling you something, it's your job to figure out if I'm tricking you or not. Okay? Not my job. I'm selling you something. My job is to sell you something. If your job is to buy, you better be aware of what you're buying. Okay? So it's like when somebody sells you a house and doesn't tell you that there's mold everywhere. It's your job to find out there's mold everywhere. That's how higher education in the U.S. has become, I'm going to argue. Okay? So, universities in the United States love to talk about how they're interested in public good. Okay? And by public good, I mean values, producing students who are going to be engaged with their communities and that Wisconsin idea. Universities love to talk about that, and they love to put it in their mission statements. And here's some examples of this. Campus Compact is this organization of universities that proclaim that they are, in fact, devoted to this notion of public good. And it was begun in 1985, and now 1,200 colleges and universities, I'm calling them IHEs, institutions of higher education, are members. And there's 6 million students that attend these institutions. The Carnegie Foundation started a classification a few years ago called community engagement. And you have to demonstrate that you're an engaged university, you're engaged with your community and doing all sorts of different kind of civic engagement, public service kinds of things. And there's 115 college universities that were in that in 2010. My university is currently in the process of trying to prove to Carnegie that we're a publicly engaged, a community engaged university. It's a pain in the butt, okay? But we're trying to do it because we think there's some value to saying that. Research on university mission statements demonstrates that institutions of higher education consistently mention values and academic purpose. They talk about the role of curriculum and co-curriculum and how it's at the core of what they do. They talk about students' intellectual and moral development as a core mission, a core function of the university. That we are here to promote learning. We are here for students to find out who they are and to develop as citizens, right? These are wonderful goals, right? Lofty goals. And they talk about their commitment to the region and the commitment to economic development in the region. We're going to be a driver for economic development in the region. And I argue, and some of my research has argued, that in fact there's a disconnect between mission and message. And I'm hoping this works. I should have asked for speakers. I'm sorry about that. I didn't. So I'm going to juxtapose here for you the mission and the marketing of two institutions. The first one is Grand Valley State University, and I'm picking on these places. I hope we have no alums of Grand Valley State University in the room. I thought that was pretty safe. Am I safe? Okay. Grand Valley State is a public university in Michigan, in the southwestern part of Michigan, and its mission statement says that it is here to educate students to shape their lives, their professions, and their societies. The university contributes to the enrichment of society through excellent teaching, active scholarship, and public service. Sounds like a wonderful place, doesn't it? It does. It sounds like a wonderful place that you would be glad to give your tax dollars to because it's going to contribute to society and make us all better, right? And this is their marketing message. All right, so that was, and that's the next Grand Valley ad here right after it. Hold on. So that was Grand Valley State marketing message. Does that sound like a university? Was that marketing message consistent with the idea of shaping students' lives and contributing to enriching society? Or was it more about, I'm not sure what it was about. But there were a lot of very fast pictures, because Americans like very fast pictures, right? About sports and fun and more fun, right? And success and value, right? Value nebulously defined, right? Value, because value is a good thing, right? So we'll throw value in there, right? And that'll be good, okay? Here's one more, and then maybe we'll let Martina back in here. Sorry, this is the last thing. So this is Seton Hall University. Seton Hall University is a small, relatively small Catholic university, and its mission is, it says, is a major Catholic university. And by the way, it's not a major Catholic university. I'd start with that. But in a diverse and collaborative environment, it focuses on academic and ethical development. Seton Hall students are prepared to be leaders in their professional and community lives in a global society and are challenged by outstanding faculty, an evolving technologically advanced setting, and a values-centered curriculum. I'd send my son or daughter there, right? It's a lovely place. Okay? Let's see what their marketing message looks like, because I'm sure they emphasize exactly those things.
And named for America's first native-born saint, Seton Hall is New Jersey's largest Catholic university. Located just outside of New York, our students experience life in and around one of the world's most dynamic cities. As a founding member of the Big East Conference, Hiram Pride runs the Welcome, Seton Hall University.
I'm glad you're enjoying those as much as I do. I watch these things all day long. I seriously do. I can't help myself. It's very sad.
It's very Catholic.
It's very Catholic, yes. When I saw that ad, the first thing I thought was Catholic. Yes.
I'd like to argue that the church was invisible throughout these images. First image, then the church from the interior, and at the end there was the church.
Right. So did you know? I absolutely agree. Did you notice that the first part of that, the first 8 seconds of that video was, it's a major Catholic university and there's pictures of students on a nice campus and church spires and things like that. And then they went to the catchy music, and it was all about, oh, and by the way, we're right next to New York City, and if you like basketball, why don't you come here and watch some, right? And then we finished up with a major Catholic university again.
It's not about education.
Right. I would argue that message was less about education than their mission was. Very different, right? Yes.
But one doesn't have to be a big intellectual to see that this is nothing. But this is the same with all advertisements nowadays. Even if an advertisement for a car doesn't start with a car, but with something completely else.
Yes. Yes.
And isn't that something really terrible in present day society?
Well, I don't really care. I mean, perhaps so. I think selling cars and selling education should be different things, right? I don't think, if you looked at Toyota's mission statement, for example, Toyota's mission statement isn't about enriching the world's character through cars. It's about selling good cars, right? And really selling cars. They're a publicly traded organization. Their job is to sell you a car, right? And if they can prove it's more reliable, right? They're functioning in a very different kind of environment than higher education. Higher education can't prove that it's reliable, or it's very hard to prove you're a reliable, high quality institution. So we settle for this kind of thing when we come to sell it, right? So it's different in that sense. And I would argue Toyota is also not accepting a lot of federal and state dollars. Seton Hall students are funded with federal dollars, right? So I think they have an obligation with their mission to be a little bit closer to their mission in their marketing. But we could talk about that. There are lots of people in the U.S. who absolutely agree with what you're saying. And there's people who look at the work I do and say, oh, of course colleges sell themselves that way. Why should we care? And I'm going to talk about in a few minutes why I think we should care. You know, what is the consequence of this? Should we care, right? Should we care that college universities have become more corporate in the way they sell? And here's some other examples. So, you know, my research has indicated that, and some of Jeroen's work as well has indicated that the way college universities sort of market themselves on the web. We just came out with a paper talking about how do you sell a college university on the website. And what we describe it as academic consumerism, right? So you sell. This is a screenshot from Princeton, and I apologize for being black and white. I took them from the article. So this is what you see when you sell academics. When you sell sort of core academic functions through the websites. What you see is this kind of thing, where the professor and the student are engaged in this. Not really a teacher learner kind of environment, but a friend, colleague. The text that accompanies these kinds of things is often like, our teachers are here for you, night and day. Their doors are open. Come on in. Teachers are, as a co-author of mine wrote, a combination of Marie Curie, Mr. Chips, and Mr. Rogers, right? They're wonderful researchers, 12 hours a day, and the rest of the day, they just want to help you, right? And they're just here to make your lives better, okay? We sell with technology. This is an ad from Iowa, right? So when we sell core academic functions, we don't sell the teaching and learning, we sell the technology. You're going to be in a great technological space, right? How do we sell? This is how we sell the collegiate experience. This is a big part of those products, right? Both Grand Valley and Seton Hall, they weren't selling education. They were selling a collegiate experience, I would argue. They were selling, come to college because you come to a college where you can go to a residential college and you can experience being a college student, right? One could argue that's being sold around here to some extent, okay? So, Indiana University, member of the Big Ten. They have on one of their banners, one of the more popular banners, college should be like this. Okay, so it's this unabashed sort of normative notion of what the collegiate experience should be like. And if you want that, you've got to come to Bloomington, Indiana, because all of our buildings are made out of limestone, the lawns are perfectly manicured, and it's a wonderful place to be a student, right? And there's lots of bars right near campus, right? I know that that's not the case here, certainly. And pizza places. I also know that's not the case here. This is Dartmouth, right? Member of the Ivy League, very elite private institution, and they're selling. I'm not sure what they're selling there, right? There not too many Americans are riding bikes on campus, so that's pretty impressive. I sort of joke to my friends that they're selling, come to Dartmouth and enjoy the collegiate experience, and the black people here aren't very scary. I think is what they're selling as well. Okay, you laugh, but I think that's the message. Okay, so what are the repercussions of this? What are the consequences of this? I argue that treating students like customers might be connected to some of the problems that we're seeing in American higher education. And I'm wondering, if your students are customers, do they learn as much? Do customers learn as much as non-customers, right? If students are seen as that. Interesting book came out by Richard Aram and Joseph Araksa in 2011. If you get a chance to read this, it's quite good. It's called Academically Adrift, and they found a lot of very disturbing things about American higher education. They were looking at fairly elite places. And what they discovered was that, in general, students make pretty small gains in their learning in college. And many students, maybe approaching half, fail to make any significant gains on a very well-used instrument called the collegiate learning assessment. They also discovered that more than half of students were not writing, when surveyed, had not written more than 20 pages of work for a class in a given semester. Okay? Many students were not being encouraged to read more than 100 pages a week in their classes. Okay? And there were low levels of engagement in that's what I've just described, low levels of engagement in serious academic work. So students aren't reading and writing as much as they used to be. Students are being assigned less work, and students are exhibiting learning gains that aren't particularly impressive. And my guess is that if I think of my students as customers, and if I'm nimble and responsive to this, to the point where I realize that tuition revenue is what's driving my institution, and my customers don't want to work as hard, perhaps I will give them less work. And if I market my institution as an institution where you can come and have fun and enjoy the collegiate experience, and professors are here to help you in the sense that not challenge you, but to actually help you, that when I come to college, I might expect that it's going to be fun, that I'm here for the collegiate experience, and that professors are going to be here to help me, not to challenge me. Okay? So I guess my point is that if there's this disconnect between mission and message, and we're sending out, your point was we're sending these messages to different communities, and that's a comment I get a lot, which is the mission statement isn't designed to be read by the students, it's designed to be read by no one. Right? But the marketing message is designed to be interpreted by prospective students. We shouldn't be surprised those are different. Yes, you shouldn't be surprised that they're different, but you shouldn't also be surprised if the people who are getting your message come to your institution and expect what you tell them is going to happen. They expect that to happen. If you tell them that college is going to be fun and relatively unchallenging, don't be surprised when they come to college and expect it to be fun and relatively unchallenging. Okay? I talked a little bit about the cost of college, buyer beware. Our research is also when website research, viewbook research. When colleges are asked, and this is getting better, but it's only getting better because of the federal government. When colleges are asked about their costs when students are looking for information on the cost is sometimes hard to find. So clear information about cost is hard to find on websites and view books and places that students should be able to find it. Value, you saw that on the Grand Valley thing, right? Value is undefined, right? So places talk about investing in their future at Humboldt State University in California. But when it comes to actually finding out what Humboldt State costs, it's a little bit harder, okay? Humboldt State, by the way, has gotten better since we did our research, but again, only because of the federal government. Price is a signal, but it's hard to decipher. So you would think that the more you spend on your tuition, the more the institution's spending to educate you. But as I'm going to show you in a second, that's not actually true, right? You would also think that the price of an institution tells you something about the quality of the institution. That's not true either. Although places like to be high priced because it sends the message of quality. Similarly priced college universities are actually very different values, okay? And I mentioned the federal government. I'll talk about that here in just a second. So in the U.S. market, and this is some of the research that I sent to Jeroen that I hope he shared with some of you, we can talk about later. In the U.S. market, price does not equal cost, does not equal spending, okay? And let me talk about what I mean by that, and I've given a couple of examples here. We did research looking at the relationship between the sticker price of an institution, that is what they claim to cost, right? The price of the institution, so like sticker price on a car. Research between that, the amount they actually spend on you, education and related expenditures per student, right? And the amount you actually paid. Because in the United States, it's very unusual for a student to actually pay the sticker price. So what happens at most institutions is, I publish a sticker price of X, okay? I don't expect many students to pay X, right? It's sort of like selling a car, right? If you want to come in and you want to go to your this is the way it works in the US, I assume in Europe. If you want to go into the car dealer and look at the sticker price and write him a check for that, he will gladly accept that, okay? But he isn't expecting you to do that. And the same is true in the higher education in the United States. There's a sticker price, and then there's a price that most students actually pay. That's the net tuition price after discount, okay? So on the y-axis here, you've got the ratio of that net price to the subsidy that's being provided. And the subsidy is the difference between the net price and what they're actually spending on you to educate you. So let me give you an example. If the sticker price is $50,000 and the discount rate is 50%, students are actually paying $25,000. But if it actually costs $30,000 to educate you at that institution, you're getting a $5,000 subsidy, which is the difference between that $25,000 and the actual cost of educating you. That's how U.S. higher education system works. And generally speaking, you should always be getting a subsidy. You should always be paying less than it costs to educate you. Okay? It's not actually the case anymore, by the way. So here's a couple examples. We did a study of institutions that were charging more than $50,000 in sticker price, right? And what we wanted to understand is, are there differences among this group of institutions with regard to types of subsidies students are getting relative to the price they're paying, the actual money they're spending on their education? And you can see from this, we can talk about this a long time, we won't. There's a great distribution. There's a lot of variance here. And depending on, from a student's point of view, these places might look the same. They're all charging $50,000 plus. They all must be really good. They all must be really good colleges, right? Probably not. They all must be spending a lot on my education, right? Maybe. Okay? So, if you are a student and you choose institution X on average, you will spend, institution X spends $35,000 approximately on you to educate you. Every student, they spend $35,000 to educate. Okay? The students attending that institution on average pay $26,000 in net tuition, and they get a subsidy of $9,000. Okay? That means, so that 26 plus 9 is equal to the actual cost of spending on you. Okay? Sounds okay. If you chose this institution, that institution spends $50,000 to educate each one of its students. You're going to spend $25,000 in net tuition, about the same as you would spend at institution X, but you're going to get a $25,000 subsidy. Okay? So, in terms of value, in terms of bang for your buck, as we would say, you're getting a lot more at this institution than you're getting at this institution. You're spending about the same, but you're getting 70% more spent on you, something like that, right? That's a huge, huge difference. But there's no way for students to figure out that. There's no way for the average student to actually know that. because that's not published anywhere. This is research that's published in journals, and I'm guessing students are not reading this research before they choose an institution, right? So it's buyer beware, right? So what happens also? So we've got customers in buyer beware. We've got customers being sold something different, perhaps, and not learning as much. We've also got what happens when you start thinking customers as a student says customers. Well, customers buy things on credit. If they're Americans, they buy things on credit because we like credit. So these are some interesting charts, and we could talk a lot about these. But the story here is that student loan debt is increasing, and students are increasingly finding it harder and harder and harder to pay off that student loan debt. And the reason student loan debt is increasing so fast is going back to what Tro talked about, our funding for higher education model, which is increasingly reliant on tuition, which results in us thinking about students as customers, which has created fields of enrollment management, which means we want to get every dollar out of every student/customer that we can possibly get out of them, right? And there's very little incentive to hold down costs, and there's much more incentive to actually go after to actually raise your costs and find students who are willing to pay that. All right, so other consequences of this academic consumerism. Why does this matter? Well, there's decreased public confidence in higher education. If you look over time in the U.S. in public opinion polls, what you see is higher education increasingly being seen like a business. So these are just recent data. So 2007, for example, about 40% of folks thought that colleges care most about educational experience. That's eroded to 35%. In 2007, 50% of people said colleges are like businesses. In 30 years ago, that would have been more like 20%. In 2010, it's now up to 62%. So people think colleges are acting more and more like businesses. Why does that matter? Well, it gets more government involvement. So one of the things that made us nimble, one of the things that made us really responsive was lack of government involvement and our independent nature. Well, now the government says, you know what, you've been very bad about the way you've been explaining how you're priced. So every institution has to have what's called a net price calculator out there that has to figure out and tell you as a prospective student what you might expect to pay to attend this institution, right? And the Obama administration, which is actually pretty friendly to higher education, has said, enough of this, we're going to start publishing which institutions have really poor graduation rates and which institutions actually spend more money per student, right? And universities are scared of this, by the way, very scared of this. So bad press on student loan debt. More and more, the stories on higher education are less about the great things higher education is doing and more about how students graduate with $80,000 in debt and how are they ever going to pay this back. Okay, and they always choose the student who graduates with 80, even though the average student graduates with a lot less, but that's the way the media is. And there's this increasing blur between not-for-profit and for-profit higher education. It used to be, I think that the perception is that for-profits acted like this. That is, there's higher education, there's universities out there that are designed to make a profit with publicly traded shares. They operate like this, and not-for-profits operate like this. The closer those get together, the less confidence we're going to have in the not-for-profit sector, and the less likely it is that we're going to be wanting to contribute towards the nonprofit sector with our taxes, right? And you see that state support for higher education has gone like this, or from your perspective like this, okay, over time. Not good, which has just ratcheted up tuition more, which has caused more and more of these problems. Okay? That's it. Questions?
Well, let me first thank you for a
Yes.
wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.